My name is Remko Leemhuis, and I'm the director of AJC's Berlin office. I'm thrilled to discuss the issues that are of concern to us regarding the transatlantic relationship today with two experts. We are honored to have with us today Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger. Wolfgang is the head of the Munich Security Conference and a close friend of AJC and David Harris for almost 2 decades. Under his leadership, the Munich Security Conference has become the most important geopolitical gathering in the world, and AJC has the honor of hosting events during this conference each year. We are honored that the Munich Security Conference has agreed to partner with us in hosting this session. Wolfgang also looks back at a distinguished career as a diplomat for the Federal Republic, most notably as ambassador to the United States and ambassador to Great Britain. To discuss the issues at hand, I'm also happy to welcome Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, Director of AJC Europe, also an outstanding expert on transatlantic and European relations. So, Ambassador Ischinger, to start off our conversation, what is your current assessment of the transatlantic relationship?
Well, first of all, let me say how honored I feel and how privileged to have been invited into this conversation with AJC. It's been a privilege for me, as was just said, for many, many years to work with the American Jewish Committee. I've been involved with the Berlin office, I think more or less ever since it was established more than 20 years ago. I think we've had a really good and trustful relationship. And I want to, before I try to respond to your question, I want to just recall one anecdote about this relationship. You know, we're going to be talking about all sorts of challenges in the current transatlantic environment. But when I arrived as the newly appointed ambassador on the day after 9/11 in September of 2001, the transatlantic mood for the first few months was actually pretty good. We began to send soldiers to Afghanistan, etc., and there was a relationship of communicating and trusting each other. And then, of course, came the Iraq issue. And all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. And some Europeans, including the Germans, had a very different view than the Bush administration. And as the ambassador in Washington, I was really scratching my head and thinking about who is going to help me find the right way and find the right way of expressing why Germany is doing what we're doing and how are we going to behave during this challenging moment. And you know who helped me most? David Harris, because a friend of mine in Washington suggested to me, why don't you talk to the Jewish exile community, to the community that has a relationship with Germany, mostly living in New York. So I went to see some of the representatives of the German Jewish community. Then I showed up at your offices in Midtown Manhattan, and I literally asked David, help me. I don't know how to move beyond this. And I'm not going to now talk about, trade secrets, but David and the American Jewish Committee and a number of personalities involved were really very helpful in smoothing the way and helping us open doors and communicating better. So I want to just say thank you. I owe a debt of gratitude on behalf of my former embassy colleagues in those years. Now, very briefly, speaking about today, I was involved in a German discussion just a couple of hours ago with senior representatives of the German Bundeskanzleramt and the business community. And I said, and I want to repeat this here, we have never had a period in the German-American or European-American relationship that was totally and only harmonious. We've always had challenges. Some were business-oriented, some were military. Today we have this famous 2% problem where the Germans are lagging behind, et cetera, et cetera. Very different issues. Differences about Iran, about the Middle East, about Russia, and so on. But never before in the about 45 years that I believe I can look back over, never before have we had so many unresolved transatlantic challenges all confronting us at the same time. You know, here is the JCPOA thing, Iran. Here is it a good idea or a bad idea withdrawing US troops from Germany? Is it a good idea or a bad idea for Germany to continue the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with the Russians over the Baltic Sea? What about our efforts to deal with China? Some Americans are asking us, are you with us or are you against us in the confrontation, in the competition with China? And I could go on and on and on. So this is a challenging moment. And let me conclude by saying that I think the right response from us on the European side is to understand that if we have a problem with the current president sitting in the White House, we should always be mindful of the fact that America is a lot more than just the White House. There are actually 50 states, there are governors, there are 100 senators, there is a vibrant civil society, there are intimate business relationships. So my motto, and I will repeat this right here, is, you know, not turning away from this relationship, but on the contrary, engage, engage, engage. There are many on the American side with whom we need to engage. It's in our own interest. And if it doesn't work with this particular person or that particular person in the State Department or in the White House or elsewhere, we have many other partners in America throughout the country that we're well advised to engage in a very, very intense way. So that's my recipe for how to best deal with this really challenging moment of so many unresolved issues.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for sharing this personal story. Simone, I'd like to ask you the same question on what is your assessment about the state of the transatlantic relationship, and maybe you can also add a little on what AJC is doing to strengthen and preserve this vital relationship.
Sure. First of all, good hello, everybody. It is an honor to be conversing with Ambassador Ischinger today, seeing my fellow German friends here. Yes, I think, first of all, I couldn't agree more with what Ambassador Ischinger said. The issue of engage, 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 as he put it, is, I think, absolutely crucial. And I think the original story that he discussed about his personal experience with AJC on the ground is exactly, I think, what we as AJC are trying to do. But yes, I do believe that we are currently going through a profound crisis of the transatlantic relationship, which I think on the American side has not just started with this administration. I think the reality is that we have seen some of the sort of isolationist trends before. They are, I think, deeply rooted. And it is our job to try and counter them. On the other side, and I'm sure we'll discuss it later on, I think there are also some profound challenges that we have within the European Union. disunion and some of our own difficulties that we have to face. But you asked the question of sort of what AJC is doing. First of all, I would say that the transatlantic angle to AJC is really sort of the essential part of our DNA. It is a strong belief that we share common values, that we share common interest of democracy and of liberal democracy, I would even say. Even before the breakup of the Soviet Union, AJC was the first Jewish organization to call for the recognition of the independence of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. As an addition, we've been staunch supporters of the Western Military Alliance. We have been early advocates of NATO enlargement. So it's really, we have an old history, I would say, in really reaffirming the transatlantic relationship. And maybe two additional points, I think we also have sort of structurally have really tried to act accordingly. We have 8 European offices that I oversee. We have association agreements with dozens of Jewish communities across the European continent. We established the AJC Transatlantic Institute, which has the exact purpose of promoting this important transatlantic relationship. So I think we have really sort of in our own being, we have really proved that it is part of what we defend, of who we are. And finally, we have also actually just recently, a couple of years ago, initiated a new transatlantic charter. A document that we published in the New York Times and at the same time in the French newspaper Le Monde, and that was signed by hundreds of people, including personalities such as Joe Biden, Tony Blair, Manuel Valls, former secretaries of state, George Shultz and Madeleine Albright. And that reaffirm really everything that I just mentioned, our commitment to the rule-based international order, our confidence in NATO, our trust and respect for the European Union, our determination to assure the integrity of the West's intelligence, law enforcement, and security agencies. And finally, again, for me at least, the most important point, our defense of democracy, and again, I would say of liberal democracy.
Thank you, Simone. Ambassador Ischinger, since World War II, the Transatlantic Alliance has been, in geopolitical terms, the most important and dominant relationship. Over the last, let's say, 2 decades, we have seen this vital relationship deteriorating. Do you agree? And if so, why is that?
I don't agree. I mean, no doubt about it. We have had fragmentation. We've had, as Simone put it, we're currently engaged in a really serious transatlantic crisis. But I would underline it's not the first time. This may be more difficult to resolve than previous ones, but I'm quite confident that we can move beyond this if everybody on both sides, if there is enough goodwill. But let me make a specific German point about this. When I was born, right after the end of World War II, when I started to develop a little, as a schoolboy, a little bit of interest in history and later on in politics, I began to understand that Germany, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, found itself, unfortunately and sadly, on the wrong side of history, obviously, with a German Sonderweg, which led to catastrophic results, including the Holocaust. And I mean, I don't need to spell this out in greater detail here, but my point is a different one. My generation strongly believed and continues to believe, and I think later generations, younger generations, share this belief that in the post-World War II period, Germany's mission was to try to become part of the West. Now, what exactly may that be, the West? As defined by yours truly here, the West has been symbolized for me and my generation by the United States, by the White House, by the idea of freedom, by the Declaration of Independence, by American innovation, et cetera, by the American idea. And obviously in the post-World War period, it was America, it was the United States that led the West, has been leading the West for these last 6 or 7 decades. Now, if we are now getting the impression that the West, as we defined it, an alliance of countries and of peoples which share the same values, the values of fundamental human rights, of freedom of expression, of equality, etc. If the impression is created that the United States is no longer willing or capable or whatever of leading this alliance, that is a far more painful thing for us to suffer through as Germans than maybe for my French or British friends. Why? And I don't mean this facetiously. For a Frenchman, it's not so important to have the White House as the symbol of the West. A Frenchman believes that they invented the West in 1789. And of course, my British friends believe that they invented democracy 1,000 years ago. So they are far more self-confident. We lost our way. And we finally found this new symbol, the White House. So if in this current transatlantic crisis, it is very hard for German parents or grandparents, I'm a new grandfather now. It's very hard for me to explain to my little grandson that if he looks for the symbol of the values that we want to stand for, he should look at the White House. That's, in the current situation, not so easy. So in other words, we are really losing the unifying symbol in a much more direct and as far as I'm concerned, far more painful way than I think is the case for many of my French and British and Dutch and Danish or other friends. So we need, that is my message, we need the transatlantic relationship. This is our destiny. We wanted to be part of the West. We got the chance by American generosity to be re-included in the Western world. That's a wonderful gift by our friends from NATO, from the Western Alliance, and from within Europe. And we certainly need to maintain that. That is part of, I would say, the German DNA. 2 fundamental ideas: the idea of European integration, preventing future wars among Europeans, and creating a strong bond and a permanent bond, not a bond just for this or that crisis management, a strong transatlantic bond, creating a strong Western world. And quite frankly, at a moment when great power rivalries are reappearing and appear to dominate international relations in a way we haven't seen in the last number of decades, this Western alliance, this idea of the West, becomes ever so important. So I want to make sure that we do whatever we can to contribute to maintaining this Western alliance, regardless of who sits in the White House at this moment or who is the Chancellor of Germany or the President of France. People change, the fundamental mission remains.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I guess we at AJC agree. Simone, I would like to pose the same question to you, and maybe you can add a few thoughts on how internal fractures in the European Union are impacting the transatlantic relationship.
So first of all, what an incredible appeal, I would say. I wouldn't change a single word of what Ambassador Ischinger just said, of this need for this transatlantic alliance, of the world order that we created. I'm not sure that my generation, that was born a little bit later after the Second World War, has the same sense of this today. And I think it is up to us, as Ambassador Ischinger said, to reinvigorate those values and reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship. As to your question about some of the internal divisions within the European Union, yes, I think to some extent, first of all, yes, there are enormous European divisions. There's no doubt about this. It is probably the most successful political project after World War II. But we have seen definitely over the past few years growing divisions. There is Brexit, of course. There are potentially other exits, Frexit. There's always different talk about possible other exits. It's the question of European cohesion. There is the question of anti-democratic nationalist trends that we see all over Europe, without a doubt, whether it's from parties or even some that come to government that are strongly anti-European, populist. So we are seeing that. We are seeing growing diverging interests. Also a relatively sort of slow, if I may say so, European administration that has difficulties, and I think in finding solutions to some of the grave issues that we are dealing with, whether it's migration. We saw a relatively slow start at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, particularly in terms of solidarity to some of the southern countries. I think a lot has changed over the last couple of weeks and months, thank God. But we did see, indeed, at the beginning some very slow reactions, in particular in Italy, which then translated in very anti-European sentiments also in the Italian population, for example. And maybe also sort of to add to that, maybe because to some extent that European built itself in an area of sort of the end of history, as Fukuyama said, makes it not particularly well equipped in sort of to be dealing with some of the major challenges that we have and that are coming. So there's, I think, also a wider question of how the European Union will evolve and will evolve. Will it become stronger? Will it become more reactive? Will it actually have political power in order to be dealing with some of those some of those challenges? And so I think, if you put all of this together, as a partner on the other side of the Atlantic, at a time when there are a lot of insecurities, when there is a major global power struggle, when we have powers like China, like Russia, who are, wanting to destabilize the European Union, certainly also the transatlantic relationship. I think that, yes, Europe has to do its own part in making itself a little bit more of a political powerhouse, I would say.
Thank you, Simone. Ambassador Ischinger, you already touched upon these issues in your opening remarks. Over the last years, the liberal world order is more and more challenged by authoritarian powers such as China and Russia. Are we seeing that Europeans and the US parting ways on how to deal with these threats?
Well, I hope not. I hope that we can figure out joint approaches to these long-standing challenges, such as, Russia, the former Soviet Union, and China with an increasingly offensive or more aggressive foreign policy as we have been observing for the last several years. But let me just take 30 seconds to add a comment to what Simone has just said. The European Union almost, I've strongly believed throughout these crises, financial crisis, I've strongly believed that those who thought they could predict the demise, the collapse of the EU or of the Eurozone, I always strongly believe they were wrong, and they turned out to be wrong. The EU still exists, but an important but, in the current pandemic crisis, I think we were really close to reaching a breaking point. When I look at the polling, Simone will know what I'm talking about. When I look at polling data from Italy from late March or early April, where the Italians believe that the Chinese are better friends for them than France or Germany or so, what kind of world are we talking about here? And what's going on? Where did we go wrong? So no doubt about it, the EU is fighting for survival. We have the challenge of Brexit. I mean, for the first time, a country leaving this union. We have a challenge to the rule of law, to the idea of, the democratic values. When we look at what our Polish friends and Hungarian friends are going through in terms of their domestic debates, we have a huge foreign policy challenge. Is anybody taking the EU seriously? My own government, the German government, started the process, inviting all other EU members and certainly the United States and others to try to move the Libyan catastrophe forward. Remember, we had a conference in Berlin in the early months of this year, pre-crisis. It seems to me that the actors on the ground in the Libyan conflict, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Russia, and others, are not really reacting to these types of efforts. So we are really being challenged. We need to figure out a way to speak with one voice. We, as 27 members of the European Union, and so we're confronted by several simultaneous crises at the same time. The rule of law crisis, the fragmentation, the Brexit crisis, the foreign policy crisis, the speaking with one voice crisis. And if we can't figure out a way to speak with one voice as the EU, we should not be surprised if the United States doesn't take us seriously as we confront China or as we try to deal with Russia. So there's a huge workload ahead for the European Union, and that would be the case even if the pandemic crisis had not hit in the first part of this year. We would still be confronted with very serious issues. So just to conclude this, when I look at all these EU issues, it's even more important that we can count on a reliable relationship with the United States built on trust, where we can call on each other when push comes to shove. And let me just mention one, of course, very controversial issue where some Americans have different views than many Europeans and vice versa. The plan of the current Israeli Prime Minister, of proceeding with the annexation plan, I think it is our job to, on the basis of our convictions, to tell our Israeli friends in the most frank and direct, and hopefully not always simply public ways, what we think is good the region, good for the country, because what's going on and the future of Israel is for me, for my generation, for my country, for Chancellor Merkel, and surely for her successors, a central concern of German policy. We have declared only one country a central issue, eine Frage der Staatsräson of Germany, and that is Israel. So we have very special ties for obvious reasons, and there is a deep concern that hopefully a way forward can be found, which will not create more conflict and more division in the region and in the transatlantic community.
Thank you, Ambassador Ischinger. Simone, so what is your take on this, and how do you assess, above all, the deepening split over the Atlantic in dealing with China?
So listen, specifically about China, and then maybe we can also afterwards speak about Israel. First of all, I think what's happening between China and the United States is probably one of the sort of determining foreign policy issues of the years, maybe of the decade to come. And it will not only have repercussions for the United States and for China, but it will have repercussions for the rest of the world. So that's the first. The second is, let's also be clear that I think China's behavior, including within the European Union, and I'm sitting right now here in Paris, where the Minister of Foreign Affairs issued a quite unusual declaration, let's say, put it that way, a warning against the Chinese ambassador in France, where because there was a huge amount of negative propaganda coming from the Chinese embassy here in Paris. So the attitude of China also in Europe has been pretty aggressive, actually, to the extent that Josep Borrell actually himself said that Europe had been somewhat naive in the past about China. So from my perspective, and I think from AJC's perspective, what I believe is crucial is that the United States and Europe will find a path of dialogue. I think there has been a first constructive step when the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, joined the foreign ministers meeting a couple of days ago to discuss specifically China. But I think it's very important that there is a path of dialogue between the United States and Europe on China. And again, I think we at AJC have a specific role certainly to play as well, because we are, of course, our mother home, our mothership is based in the United States. We're an American organization, but we also are, of course, in Europe, as I mentioned earlier on. And we also have specifically an Asia Pacific Institute that deals with Asia and China in particular. So I think we at AJC also have a role to play in creating some sort of constructive dialogue there. But I definitely think that we will have to find a pathway between Europe and the United States on China, also coming around on what we discussed earlier on values.
Thank you, Simone. Ambassador Ischinger, so for us at AJC, two topics are of especially of concern, of course. It's Israel and it's Iran. And we're also seeing on these both issues a split over policy between Washington and the European Union. And maybe you can talk about these two issues combined, because I guess we have we cannot address them separately. So what is your take on this and the fact that we're seeing profound policy differences over the Atlantic?
I think the difference, I think the Iran problem is the one where the difference, at least at the current moment, is more difficult to overcome than on Israel. You know, as far as Israel is concerned, I tried to make a comment about the current, the annexation issue. But by way of adding a small anecdote from my ambassadorial days in the post or during the Iraq crisis in 2002, 3, 4, etc., 15 years ago, of course, mainstream thinking in America, as I recall, felt that we, the Germans and the French and a few others, we were not good friends and allies, and we were sort of about to ignore the interests of Israel as far as getting rid of Saddam Hussein and so on and so forth. And what saved me at the time in the discussions that I had with senior members of the US Senate and committees of Congress was I was able at the time to point out to my American interlocutors and certainly also to interlocutors from the American Jewish community, including from your organization. I said, give me one name of a president of a serious country who has been to Israel 33 times. And that sort of put a stop on the discussion, and everybody scratched his head and said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, Johannes Rau, who was at that time the federal president of Germany, had actually traveled through his political career to Israel 33, 34, or 35 times. I don't recall the exact number, doesn't matter. In any case, he made it practically an annual thing, and he knew practically everybody, left and right, in Israel. So simply, for me, this sort of symbolizes the intensity of the German-Israeli relationship. And all else is diplomatic tactics. On Iran, I think we have a more fundamental problem. You see, the origin of the Iran effort started by the United Kingdom, France, and Germany in 2003, a long, long time ago. The origin of that was we allowed ourselves to be divided in this Iraq debate. Let's not have a repetition of that. Let's try to agree and formulate a joint approach to the next problem. And the next problem, obviously, was going to be Iran, because we were all beginning to get worried about Iranian nuclear activities. So we started this process in 2003. It took a long time. It took almost a decade for the United States then to come in and join this process, and finally to actually lead it. This was, of course, during the Obama administration, with John Kerry being an active participant in the negotiations. As a practicing diplomat, I will say the following. The result of this long negotiation over so many years is not great. It's not a good agreement. It covers only a small part of the agenda. It doesn't cover ballistic missiles. It doesn't cover Hezbollah. It doesn't cover terrorism and other regional activities that we find abominable as far as Iran is concerned. But it covered an interesting segment, namely the nuclear development. So my view has been, over this entire debating period, the last several years, that an insufficient arrangement, the JCPOA, is better than no arrangement at all. And can we maybe make an effort to add on to that, to build on it, and start a discussion with the Iranians about the untouched and unresolved issues in the next phase? So, you know, as a practicing diplomat, you think of diplomacy being the art of the possible. And it was simply not possible to get all of these agenda items resolved in one round. So we thought of it as a step-by-step process. The Trump administration, of course, took a different view and said, we don't like the agreement because it doesn't cover everything, and therefore we step away from the agreement. The question is whether that will make us and everybody else, and especially Israel, living in greater safety and security than if we stayed in the agreement and if we had tried together with the United States to start engaging the Iranians. Nobody has any doubts about the nature of the regime, but let me conclude yet again with a sort of a practical remark as a practicing diplomat. Diplomacy, and I think this is not a direct quote, but almost a direct quote from Henry Kissinger, who's been a mentor of mine for many decades. Diplomacy is the art of negotiating with the bad guys. With the good guys, you go and have dinner or have a beer. With the bad guys, it takes a lot of work, and sometimes it takes a second attempt and the third attempt. And I know a little bit of how this works because I was personally engaged for an important period of my own professional life dealing with pretty obnoxious people, including, Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia, who was responsible for genocidal activities in his part of the world. But we thought that negotiating with him was better than not negotiating with him. So we are stuck with this unresolved Iranian matter, and I admit to you that there is no perfect solution. We tend to believe that trying to build on what we worked out in 2015 was not a bad idea going forward, but I'm not sure whether that will actually now be possible in the current environment. So this is a very, very worrisome situation, I have to admit. And I read the reports about ongoing Iranian violations of the agreement. They seem to be stepping away from it. So we may actually find ourselves be back at square one before too long, and that would be pretty daunting to restart this process again, because I don't see any, quite frankly, I don't see any military solution to this, even if I let my creative spirits roam. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ischinger. So before we wrap up this conversation, maybe, Simone, you can also briefly address these two issues, since we need to be mindful of our time.
Yeah.
Of course. So very, very quickly, about Israel, I think you started off with the fact that there are two different approaches from the United States and Europe on Israel. Maybe if I can specifically address Europe, I think there is overall a good European-Israel relationship. Only recently, Joseph Borrell spoke with Foreign Minister Ashkenazi, so in a relatively positive conversation, speaking about strong political, historical, and cultural ties. But yes, let's be honest, there are obviously issues. There is no doubt about the fact that, for example, the EU decided in 2009 to condition any upgrade in its ties with Israel on progress of the peace process, which means that the Association Council Agreement meeting has not taken place since 2012. While other association agreement meetings have taken place between the EU and Egypt, for example, and other countries where there are also, let's say, issues. But I think what is important, and what we at AJC, I think, are trying to do is to try to explain to Europeans, and I think many do agree, is that Israel is not only the only democracy in the Middle East, meaning that Israel is a country that shares values with and interests and history with Europe, but that Israel actually has something unique to bring to the table. And it's not only in Israel's interest, it's actually in Europe's interest. It is in Europe's interest to have a relationship with Israel on the issue of counterterrorism, on the issue of cybersecurity. Only recently on the coronavirus pandemic, Israel certainly had a lot to contribute. I'll give you the example of Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, who said that he realized that the urgency of the pandemic was so strong when he discussed the issue with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So it is really in Europe's interest to have a positive and strong relationship with Israel. And this is really what all of our AJC offices are doing. We are obviously what we are doing also with our Transatlantic Institute in Brussels, where we specifically created a program or a project called TFI, the Transatlantic Friends of Israel, which has the objective of bringing together Israeli, European and American lawmakers to discuss issues of common importance. And by the way, one of the upcoming issues that we will be taking up is the issue of Hezbollah. We discussed earlier on Iran. Germany, I think, has made a very important step in banning Hezbollah, or the integrity of Hezbollah, as a terrorist organization, or recognizing that Hezbollah is entirely a terrorist organization. It has been AJC's goal to convince other European nations to do so. The United Kingdom and the Netherlands have already done so, but it has not happened on the European level. So through TFI, through the Transatlantic Friends of Israel, we have decided to ask European, Israeli, and American lawmakers to sign on a declaration to ask Hezbollah to be banned. And that, I think, is really the kind of things that we can do on a sort of on a common level, on a cooperative level, on a transatlantic level. And finally, just a couple of words about Iran, and I think Ambassador Ischinger has said much about it. I actually don't think that the United States, and myself speaking a lot to European governments, have a difference in the analysis. I think that Europeans understand and agree with the United States on the threat of Iran. I think where there are divergences of views are on how to get there. And I think many Europeans don't necessarily agree with the maximum pressure approach that the United States administration is taking right now. But from my perspective, I think what is absolutely crucial is that there is and will be continued dialogue and cooperation between the United States and Europe on this particular issue, because the only one who will take advantage of the fact that there is a split between the European Union and the United States on the issue of Iran is Iran itself. And I don't think that we collectively can afford this split.
Thank you very much, Simone. And I see that Ambassador Ischinger agrees with what you've just said. And I think that perfectly wraps up our conversation. Again, thank you, Ambassador Ischinger, for addressing the AJC Global Forum, for your thoughtful and valuable insights, and for being so generous with your time. We at AJC are looking forward to our future cooperation with the MSC and hope we will have the opportunity to meet in February at the Munich Security Conference in Munich. And also thank you, Simone, for your valuable insights and for everything that you're doing as director of AJC Europe and everything you're doing that strengthens our mission here in Europe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Remko. This was a pleasure. And please, if you can, give my warm regards to David. And if I may just have another 20 seconds, I was so happy to hear that the AJC was planning to have this global event organized right here in Berlin. And I was excited about being invited to participate in organizing this or that. Too bad that the crisis has prevented this from being a physical event. But it was a great idea, and I hope at some later point in time the American Jewish community can find another opportunity to convene in Berlin. It's become a great place to be. So bye-bye from Berlin.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ischinger.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.
You're watching JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.